We're going to begin panel 3. The panel's called Future Proofing for Over-the-Horizon Operational Challenges, Lessons Learned from Warfare. I think it's a good title, but I had a little trouble figuring out what it meant just reading it, so here's my best guess. So I don't need to tell you guys, innovation in drone technology has been incredible. We have already heard a couple examples about the innovation in the first 2 panels and the type of ways drones have been deployed in commercial contexts. Unsurprisingly, a lot of this innovation has been in the electronic warfare context. Of course, a recent example being the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Eric was talking earlier about government contracting and how you can try to license or sell your technology to the government, and that's fantastic. But one possibility is that the DoD is not going to be able to tilt up an entire market of drone companies, right? It's possible. Maybe they can, maybe not. But that's where civil commercial market steps in, right? And this is a good thing. We want our government to fund innovation in technology and for that innovation to trickle down into the commercial market to benefit everybody else through various commercial contexts. And that's what we're going to be talking about for the next hour. If you're going to be deploying drones in the commercial setting, what does that look like? There's some benefits we can get from the use of drone technology in the commercial context and lessons we can learn from the battlefield. But then we also need to think about concerns around it, cybersecurity concerns, regulatory concerns, existing and in the future. And hopefully out of this panel, we're a little smarter about what tools are available and how to use them effectively and in compliance with the law. So with that, I'm going to jump right into introductions. Don will get mad at me if I don't make the introductions brief, but please, if everyone can just introduce themselves.
Is it on? Oh, it is. So I'm Evan Wolff. I'm, I guess, one of the 2 attorneys on the panel. We've separated ourselves, makes target practice a lot harder. But I'm a partner at Crowell and Mooring. I run the Privacy and Cyber Practice Group. I've been a cybersecurity lawyer for almost 2 decades now, which means I primarily help companies when they've been hacked or help them from getting hacked. And law is my second career. I started off life as a hacker for the government. I started off as an encryption analyst, and then I ran the Red Team program at the MITRE Corporation. So I had the fun job of getting to hack into networks for a living before I was a lawyer and helping companies prepare. I will say, while I'm going to be mentioning it, I spent 6 months working as an advisor to the Federal Aviation Administration on Project Vector, where we reviewed all the infrastructure for the FAA and looked at its susceptibility to threat actors like Volt Typhoon and the like.
My name is Bryan Sardoch. This is kind of my second life also. I was a deputy sheriff for 15 years, so I got into drones with the SWAT team, doing some mostly tactical operations. I happen to be doing training for the Swiss National Police, their counterterrorism unit in Switzerland. When the war popped off, ended up in the Netherlands in April to do some training for the Ukrainian military intelligence. Kind of started working with them on some stuff and various innovation cells and innovation efforts in and adjacent to Ukraine. So coming into defense, I'm kind of a baby. So April of 22 was my first kind of dipping my toe into this world. I now work with Orqa out of Croatia. So we do FPV drones. It's one of those, like I think our CEO likes to say that we didn't pivot into defense pivoted into us, because the FPV drones from Orqa were considered pretty amazing systems to begin with. And then as the war went that direction, we were able to take that and quickly iterate on end user needs. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute.
Still morning. Good morning. I'm Brett Feddersen, the Vice President of Strategy and Government Affairs for Defense Solutions. It's a manufacturer for counter-UAS. It's an RF cyber solution. Started off in law enforcement. I was a trooper in Pennsylvania, activated in the military, so I served as a helicopter pilot in the Army as well as in the intelligence side of the house. Ended up at the Pentagon, became a government civilian, and then eventually out of the FAA, White House, and DoD into the private sector.
And I'm Dan Sennott. I'm a partner at Holland & Knight, where I co-lead the Defense and National Security team. Prior to Holland & Knight, I was the staff director for the House Armed Services Committee. And then before being on the Hill, I was in the Army for about 21 years, first as an armor officer and then as a judge advocate for the rest of my career.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So we're going to start with some battlefield lessons learned. So you've deployed a drone on the battlefield, and now you have someone in the commercial context saying, what things did you learn about the use of drones there can I apply in this context here? And Bryan, I think we're going to start with you.
All right. So first with the Ukraine thing, it's the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's one of my little stickler points is it's not the Ukraine-Russia conflict. We have a big country invading its little neighbor, and this created a context that kind of led into the use of FPVs and some of the other commercial off-the-shelf stuff that we were in a position to leverage for basically an asymmetrical response. Those first months, like the siege of Kiev and everything, everybody was expecting 3 days, and obviously we're 3 years later, and it's still not. They're not getting conquered anytime soon. I have a lot I want to get into, but I have limited time. And one of the things I really like focusing on to make sure people are remembering is the human aspects of the technology that we're using. A lot of my time there, the first 4 to 8 months, we were looking at the failures of American systems. I was kind of on the ground level with some of those initial discoveries. Wasn't really believed very much on the U.S. side. There's a lot that some of us who are volunteering our time were bringing out in terms of intelligence that was not necessarily being accepted, like whether it's culturally or sort of the kind of collective hubris when it comes to our defense capabilities. I think a lot of that's been dispelled now. I think that there's a lot more openness to learning about what's kind of what works and what doesn't in the battlefield, but I'm still seeing a lot of kind of concerning things where not so much that people aren't focusing in the right direction, but they're maybe ignoring a couple of things. And I have notes, so hold on. On the human side, in the innovation cells and such, the human side is how can we actually use this technology? And I think that where we're at in this space right now, we have a huge amount of technology that doesn't fit into the battlefield, not because it's not good technology, because we haven't figured out how to make it, whether it's easy to use, repeatable, scalable from the logistical standpoint. So even the most robust, amazing systems from the U.S. that came over there, a lot of those would sit on a shelf just based on, okay, it's here's what's the logistical footprint, what do we need to actually support this to bring it out to a point of conflict. And this is a war where you can basically commute to war. Like you can drive 6 to 10 hours and be at any different part of the front. So it's not a huge logistics lift, but a lot of it comes down to how hard is it for people to use it and use it correctly and use it consistently with not just like how to turn it on, how to fly it, but the TTPs. These battlefield lessons, like the harshest stuff is the human survivability. For a number of reasons. Like the best people, honestly, the best people, like the people who we're kind of referencing right now, they're all dead. All the major innovators at the beginning, all the people who were willing to risk things and really like 3D print something, take it back out to the front and see if it helps. Those people all kind of died over time. So this presents a huge issue from for me. On the innovation side, is I see a lot of people leaning into using Ukraine as a battle lab kind of thing. I understand and appreciate the innovation that comes out of that. And I think there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from that. But one of the things that I think we can bring out of it as well is we got to find a better way to continue this innovation cycle, because the innovation cycles that were happening in the front, the biggest question I get from DoD, whether it's the Pentagon or wherever else, is how do we do that? Like, how do we get that innovation started here? And I was like, well, I mean, we have the capability. Like, there's a lot of smart people in this room. There's a ton of smart people in the big, the big show. It's not about having the ability. It's about having the right motivation. And I mean, the motivation could be we get invaded, which is probably worst case scenario. So how do we motivate? How do we make sure that the gear that we're putting together from a technology standpoint, as we're building it out, really matches the end users? So identifying end users, using consultants who have actual field applications engineering. And I don't know if I'm getting towards the end of my time.
No, you're doing great. Take your time.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of lessons to be learned. There's a lot of people at this point who you can learn them from. So reaching out and finding folks who have been in those situations with a relatively broad base. Something that I've learned, maybe not necessarily on the battlefield, but on the selling to the DoD battlefield, is there's a lot of people who have a very narrow view of what's happening in the war. There's a lot of people who come over and do kind of the war tourism thing, spend 2 weeks in Ukraine, come back and then sell themselves as consultants. That could be good. 2 weeks could be enough if they're going around and doing broad like discovery and actual like ground truth investigations and kind of seeing how things are going, making good contacts. But just be cautious about who you're taking advice from, and then diversify your advice. So if you're going to work with one consultant from who has time in Ukraine, like I've been the one consultant for companies where after 2 or 3 weeks, I start subcontracting out those hours to somebody else who spent time in Ukraine, because I might have a really good view of what I was involved in or saw or experienced, but a dude 3 miles down the line might have had a completely different experience, completely different set of use cases, and a completely different innovation cycle. So the innovation cycles that were there at the beginning of the war in 2022, 23 have changed significantly. Now, the innovation cells, rather than being something that's identified by leadership as like, hey, that dude's smart, I want to put him in an innovation thing. Now you got guys who are trying to look smart, so they get picked to the innovation cells and get pushed into kind of a headquarters role. And as a certain percentage are going to be doing that just to get away from the front. So the same challenges that Ukraine is now facing in terms of how do I identify talent for the innovation, the continued innovation, is something that we should be doing here, whether it's within the DoD or within the space where, you know, if you have a skunk works type person, like somebody who's doing a lot of after hours innovation on their own, identifying and enabling the innovation by those folks, providing them with gear or, you know, some limited funding or some other way to allow them to explore some of the edge use cases. Because the primary, what do you call it? I call them spec sheet warriors, you know, like the folks who have like 2 pages of specs. Like those aren't necessarily the way to go. Like keeping it simple may be way easier, because that's actually going to get used, and the other stuff won't.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
That's perfect, Bryan. Thank you.
yeah.
And
So if you have more questions, I'm certainly happy to be here. I'm here with Orqa FPV. We have a booth out there. You can find me there maybe, or just find me on LinkedIn or whatever. I obviously love talking about this stuff.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's great. And I think the battlefield lessons transitions, because we just heard the diverse variety of applications on the battlefield for drone technology, how that applies to the commercial context. And I think that transitions great into the technology that we have seen on the battlefield, that we were using on the battlefield, that, hey, maybe not the exact same tech, but similar tech can be applied into the commercial context. So, Brett, I think you were going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I take your point, but I think we break it out into a couple different effectors, right? So there's technology out there which is constantly emerging because we're all getting better at it, and because the battlefield, you know, is the best lab. It is the mother of necessity when you're out there doing operations. But then you also have tactics and techniques, right, which are in itself driving the emerging technology that we need on the defensive side or even the offensive side, and the way it's kind of going back and forth. And then when you take it a step further, there's definitely those in conflict, and then there's the homeland security aspect of things. So what we're relatively seeing, especially through the intelligence community, is that there are brand new techniques and tactics being used with brand new type of equipment. While the equipment is slowly proliferating to the U.S., the tactics, aside from some criminal organizations and the cartels, the tactics have not necessarily made it over quite yet, which gives a little bit of buffer space for, again, Homeland Security and DoD to kind of enter that space and figure out exactly what they want. We're finding some issues with that already, because DoD likes the kinetic things that blow up, not looking necessarily at the non-kinetic effectors that we have. So our system's an RF cyber system. It's used in 30 countries. It's used in 15 NATO countries, 4 of the 5 I partners. It's being used in 3 different conflict zones right now. What we have learned, or what the engineers have, I'm not going to pretend to be that smart, the engineers have figured out, is how to operate the system in a GNSS denied environment. That was a requirement that came out of Ukraine and now the Middle East. Beyond that, they've also realized that there are ways to detect and mitigate first-person viewer, and 5G drones. So again, we're seeing FPV and 5G in the U.S. We're just not seeing it being used as a tactic to be nefarious quite yet. But we all know that those tactics eventually will be adopted inside the U.S. and kind of where it goes with there. So there is no one silver bullet. Everything takes kind of an integrated approach. I think that's one thing that we always see when we come back from the battlefield is that you can't just have one big system that's going to take care of your entire issue. You've got to, have the skill sets that you're training for the individuals using the system and systems that talk back and forth to each other, whether it's command and control or whether it's kind of combining effectors like radars with RF cyber, or you end up having the kinetic back end HPM directed energy, or you go with the jammer aspect of things. So I think it's important to know that while we're seeing those changes and paying attention to those changes, there is still the industry pushing to make things better for the commercial market. DoD, as we talked about DIU earlier, DoD has to learn to embrace both sides of that field, both the homeland security piece to make sure that the defense is in place early, and then take a look again those future technologies and those future tactics and start thinking about what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, what's going to happen in the Indo-Pacific area when you're actually, trying to fight that battlefield.
Thank you so much, Brett. And we just had, I think it was Leo joined the panel. Thanks so much, Leo, for joining. Leo, if you want to give a very, give a very brief introduction of who you are, and then we're at the point in the conversation talking about technology that might have been first deployed on the battlefield, but now we're thinking about maybe deploying it in the commercial context. What does that look like?
So good morning. My name is Leo McCloskey. I'm from Echodyne, and I'm so sorry to be late. Played punt, pass, and kick with the time, so I apologize. From a technology perspective, we see that what's happening in the battlefield has to be prepared for in the homeland tomorrow, if not really today. And so the technology that we're seeing there has some application, but I think some of the things we're learning about the technology is really more important. So, for example, accuracy, right? Being able to really identify what's out there and exactly where it is. In the military space, you can sort of get away with that because you can blow things up around it. In the civilian space, you're not really going to have that luxury. And so how we identify exactly where things are is important. And I think the second thing is that as an industry, we've got divergent paths that have to somehow come together. And that is sort of in the battle space, you've got all the counter activity and you have all the blue activity, blue and red. And they're trying to figure out how not to shoot down the blues while keeping track of the reds. We're going to have the same problem here, except in the domestic side, we're building infrastructure that only looks for big objects, not looking for small objects. Mm-hmm. And we don't have the opportunity to instrument the airspace twice. So we have to do it the first time the right way.
Right. That's great. Any other thoughts on this before we move on? I mean, I want to make sure that we're thinking about, powerful technology could really help commerce be extraordinarily valuable for commercial businesses. We talked a lot about that in the first two panels, but not built in these environments, built in very different environments. And we're hearing about risks that might be associated with that. Evan, have you any thoughts?
Well, I mean, as a lawyer, I guess I see the differences in the different operating environments. And I know you heard from my colleague earlier today talking about what happens when you sell these products directly to the government and the risks associated there. But there are some pretty significant differences in terms of contracting and security requirements when you're selling things commercially. And we represent at my firm most of the largest drone manufacturers that work both commercially and in government, obviously not speaking on any of their behalves. But the first thing that we see is that companies don't understand that there's a different contractual obligation. You have different contracts. And I will say the very first thing in any incident I always tell someone to do is read your contract or have us read it for them because most people don't understand what are the requirements in their contracts. And commercial contracts have different sets of security requirements, have different sets of also liability and protection requirements. Another very important piece is understanding your security requirements themselves, because there are now increasingly privacy laws that are in place that restrict the use of drones in many states and jurisdictions, both in the U.S. and in other countries. And we're starting to see this too, is understanding the difference between the IT and OT security requirements, both commercially, but also in what you build. As I remind most of my drone clients that, yes, you operate cool things that move around in the world, but you also have computers that are connected to the internet. and connecting those computers connected to the internet is really important because as someone who spent a lot of my life dealing with hackers, they're fundamentally lazy. Don't tell them I told you that. And therefore, if they can hack into, use a known vulnerability to hack into a computer that gets backdoor access to a drone, they're going to do that. And we see that more and more. And which leads to sort of the idea of software vulnerability and manage your software liability and software vulnerability cycle, and have things like a bug bounty program, which is a lot easier to think about commercially than it is in the government setting. And then the last is understand the uniqueness of when you take battlefield technology and deploy it commercially. I was fortunate enough to be at the Department of Homeland Security for the first 4 years when we stood it up, and the great thing about that experience is we had every defense company in the world knocking on our door saying, what can we do to help? We have great technology that we're using overseas. The worst thing about that job is I had to say no, because a lot of the technology they used over there, we didn't have the opportunity and the device and the systems to use it here until we developed things like the Safety Act, which is a way of getting liability protection for basically the government contractor defense. So really there are a lot of unique security concerns. The good news is that between DHS and DoD, they are very interested in this technology innovation, and so we could talk more about that later.
Yeah. But thank you, Evan. That's great. Now, Dan, we're talking about risks associated with using drone technology, hacking, spoofing, spamming. I think there's a few things that Evan sort of alluded to. Now, I'm a commercial deployer or user, and I'm saying I want to stop that. I don't want that to happen. What resources do I have, legal or otherwise, to try to do something like that?
Yeah, so I think it's informative to just kind of review a little bit about how we've evolved. One of the things I just want to piggyback on what Evan said, a lot of my clients are defense companies, some traditional, most are actually now are non-traditional, emerging tech companies who have established in the commercial sector and want to move into the defense sector, or the Department of Defense is interested in the technology, want to bring it in. There's a whole host of different challenges, cost accounting systems and all these other things in order to move into the DoD ecosystem. But what we're seeing here is that the evolution is taking place in the military context, and now we're trying to bring it into the commercial context. And Evan pointed out some great challenges associated with that. So I think that's interesting. The other thing is, if you take a look at the war in Ukraine, it's a real wake-up call for the United States. Russia just announced they produced 1.5 million UAS of every manner in 2024. How do you protect against something like that? I mean, it is so ubiquitous. And so if you take a look at just the past few years about different drone incursions in the civilian context, 2018, the Gatwick Airport in London, there was 100,000 passengers because there were multiple drones operating on one of the runways, shut down the airport, 100,000 passengers, flights were canceled, 50 million euro in impact to the airport. 2022, there was a drone incursion at Reagan Airport, and that caused 45-minute delay. And then what's interesting is you have in January of 2025 a crash that killed 67 at Reagan Airport. Right on the heels of that, March 1st of 2025, there is all of a sudden these planes that are about ready to land get all of these anti-collision warnings. And so they wave off, fly away. Come to find out, actually, it was counter UAS technology that was being tested by the Secret Service and the Department of the Navy. So if you can imagine that happening right there in the National Capital Region without the requisite coordination, imagine what it's like if you have state and local governments each operating different systems, how complex that is. So if you look back at legislation in 2016, we've got the FAA Extension Safety and Security Act, and that established an FAA program that was really intended to be established within 180 days, right? So this is back in 2016 for fixed sites to apply for airspace restrictions for drones. no official action taken. And really the reason why, a lot of the reason why, is it was super broad. And so FAA didn't really understand what were their parameters. There were a lot of other agencies that were very concerned about, are you stepping in our space and our authority? So it advanced to 2024. The FAA Reauthorization Act has several provisions in it. One of them designed to narrowly tailor that. So it defines specifically what sites are under the jurisdiction of FAA for being able to regulate, and then added state prisons as one of those. But you've got probably 3 or 4 different provisions in there. Another major one expands FAA authority to test and evaluate counter UAS technology, and extending that authority to 2028. Now, there's a bunch of other authorities that have incrementally been extended through the course of the FAA reauthorization. One of them was then extended again to October 1st of 2024, a whole host of different authorities, until October 1st of 2025, under the continuing resolution, the FY25 continuing resolution. The whole point of that is to try and force action, right? Try and force Congress to actually take action, come up with a comprehensive plan of how to counter UAS and make sure that agencies are actually coordinating. That's still, I think, where we are hoping to see action. And I know, Evan, you're going to preview some of the stuff that's on the horizon. But really, it's been, since 2016, right, that we started this process, and we're still not very far advanced.
No, thank you, Dan. I mean, that's right. I mean, Leo, I'm kind of looking to you. It says you're marketing lead at Echodyne, and you're thinking about this regulatory, sort of complex regulatory landscape, but also at the same time, a lot of different regulations. So it's kind of a whammy on both sides for a drone manufacturer or licensor. Like, how do you talk to companies about that? How do you deal with that challenge?
Boy, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? So, when we're working with our customers, and in the mil space, it's fairly straightforward. In the civ space, it is a bit different. And we do have to counsel them on how long it takes to get something done. Yeah. But what's hard to describe is sort of the bureaucratic intransigence, right? I mean, so the FAA has been doing testing for quite some time. There are ground radars at a number of major airports that have been for quite a long time, and no one can test anything near those, right? So the ability for us to even counsel our customers as to how to work best around certain environments sort of runs into a bureaucratic wall pretty quickly. And I would say that the whole idea of testing and how it works and what that means. And so, what our customers want to hear is that the product's going to continuously improve, that the classification that our radars generate will be better every time you do a software update. All right, well, there's 2 problems there. One is that from a company perspective, we have to test and label all of that data and ingest that data. We use recursive neural networks in order to generate improved classification profiles. But the real important thing is I have to give software updates to the radars in order for them to improve performance. And software updates don't happen because we're in the government space. It's maybe an annual technology insertion. Maybe it's even worse. And so I really think that in order for this to make progress, the ability for civilians and law enforcement and public safety people to all have a common understanding of what's going on in the airspace, so that the commercial folks flying, everybody has that sort of transparency. I think for us to get there requires breaking down a lot of walls, and it's going to be very uncomfortable. And I'm not sure what the impetus for that's going to be, to be honest.
Yeah, I get it. It's a tough environment. I'll say, my experience talking to clients is similar. It's an important market. It's a market with a lot of opportunity. It's a market where people in commerce see the value. And while no one disagrees with the importance of the regulations, there's a difficulty in meeting them where they want to be met. Thank you for those comments, Leo. Brett, I think we have the next piece on the agenda, just a look at maybe proposed legislation. Like, not only is it the fact that we're currently dealing with a complex regulatory environment for commercial use of drones, but stuff's coming down the pike. And, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I wish I could give you some happy news. Just going back on what Dan had said there earlier, though, it took the UK 18 months after Gatwick to come up with policy, regulations, and authorities in order for them to have their law enforcement, their military be able to protect their airspace. And so here we are, years later, after we did about 18 months just to come up with a framework plan for the core 30 airports. We're still in this issue. So I think to highlight, the last two Congresses have had a lot of legislation. I think the last count I had in 2024 was 34 pieces of legislation that had drone or counter-drone, access to it. So we're still in the same problem. And right now, what we're seeing is we're waiting for a lot of bills to be reintroduced for the new Congress so the Congress can get after it. But what we're seeing are, stovepipes of excellence kind of across the spectrum with it. So you have, Senator Cotton came out with the stadium aspect of things. They just came out with authorities to give proposed legislation to give the Capitol Police in D.C. the authority to do it. Of course, they haven't even talked about the other 50 states or their capitals. Then you're going back and forth with the House D&I prefers a different version of their bill. Last year was 8610, which gives a big burden to the FAA and to DHS. Yeah. It was not well liked across the industry. 4333 and 1631 out of the Senate were sister companion bills. That's going to come back out here soon, a little bit different, but it's going to come out of Representative Houlihan's office. That was preferred by it. It was preferred because we had a national action plan that started being drafted during the Trump administration, was finished and published during the Biden administration. And that was, 4 years ago? So, 4 years into this piece. So I think just to know where we're at, we really are just treading water. We haven't gotten anywhere close yet. Yeah. You got to remember in 2018 when the reauthorization came out and the Emerging Technologies Act came out, the 5-year pilot program for federal law enforcement to use counter-UAS technology to determine whether it was safe to use writ large across the country. We're now in our 7th year of that, and authorities haven't changed, right? So a 5-year pilot program, now 7 years, and we still haven't done a thing. And Congress is talking about 5 state or local law enforcement departments per year out of the 18,000 we have over a 5-year period again. So we're way behind the power curve when it comes to the technology, when it comes to the tactics that are there, and when it comes to, we just haven't been able to coalesce as a country to say, let's get after the simple stuff.
And thank you for that. Bryan, maybe you have some thoughts on this too?
I have a small thought on this. If you look back maybe 3 weeks ago, a month ago, we cleared the skies over Kursk of Russian ISR. It's the first time ever. We cleared an entire oblast. I think it was like a 16-hour operation, cleared the skies for 3 days. The best counter drone is another drone running into that first drone. So like this little FPV I have here, we do like a lot of the stuff that you see online and things is it hitting ground targets. If you can get these to a proper altitude to be able to get a good intercept, you just need the human skills to be able to fly it. There's been pretty sensitive areas that a lot of robust, very, very, very expensive counter-UAS systems have been completely useless against incursion. And we get a couple FPV guys out there and we just take them out. And this is another kind of getting back to the simplicity of it. You don't need any extra regulation to start using these. You can buy these commercial off the shelf. Guys are racing these all the time at different things. Not saying that the other systems don't have a significant role, because there is, like we were talking, I forget what the millions are, but there's a lot of drones out there, and it's not like you can dedicate all your drones to that. But it's, again, going into like using these as a kind of a problem-solving solution. Is you can get these in hand now, you can have people training on it for other things, and then when the regulations do catch up, you're ready to go. I wasn't allowed to have drones on my SWAT team for the first year and a half that I had drones on my SWAT team. But I had the drones and I was training with the drones so that when things were said, okay, go for it, I'm like, all right, great. And I take out the drones and the sheriff says, we need policy. And I put the policy I had written, give them the policy. And like, we need county council to sign off. Oh, here's where they signed off on it. So you can do the prep work. This is front loading. This is getting things ready. This is training with like acquiring the stuff, using the stuff, getting in the habit of updating stuff. That's honestly like the first few months of my stuff in Ukraine, like 90% of it was updating the firmware because it was manual updates on these things. And that's another thing about making it easy. So, yeah. Did you turn it off and turn it back on?
Yeah, no, I love that, Bryan. I think that's, and I want to just emphasize that point more. Yeah, there are roadblocks ahead, but we know what needs to occur. Like we know what needs to happen to make these effectively deployed once we get the green light. So let's do that right now. And Evan, I want to maybe talk about one way you can integrate in the process, right? How you can know how the federal government is thinking about airspace, thinking about regulating that space in the way that's safe for users and your experience on Project Vector.
Sure. And just in case there was a comms malfunction on the microphone a minute ago, he said as soon as I was able and authorized to use the drones, I used them in an operating environment. I don't know if you guys caught that, but that's what he actually said. You can give me $1 later. But no, so, I spent 6 months at the end of the last administration. This goes under the category of never let a crisis go to waste. After there was a Salt Typhoon was a set of threats, a set of Chinese threat actors that were hacking largely the telecom industry. We soon realized it went far beyond telecom and ISPs into most of the critical infrastructure sectors. And there's a whole bunch of typhoons that you can't even keep track of all the different names. But the Volt Typhoon is probably the one that's pretty famous. And so what the FAA administrator did is in coordination with the Secretary Buttigieg is start off an independent advisory group to really look at the FAA infrastructure to say that, while we're going to be requiring a lot on the user community, whether it's airlines, drones, others, we also have to understand what is the risks and associated with our infrastructure. And we spent 6 months looking at all the different stuff that the FAA owns, all the 2,600 baud modems, all the data centers, and we came up with a set of recommendations. Unfortunately, it was at the end of the last administration. The good news is the report survived the change in the administration because of some of the critical challenges FAA has had since then that everyone's heard about. And so what we're seeing is really to pick up on what was said earlier, is this sort of technology evolution shift within the FAA, within the regulators, in that they are beginning to understand they can't have multiple different data centers. They need to have integrated requirements for procurement. They need to have, standard security requirements. The FAA is one of the truly unique things about it is that it doesn't have to follow the federal acquisition regulations, the FAR that my colleague talked about earlier. They are independent of that, but they really do need to create some security requirements. So we are, to those of us that are going to be on the sort of downstream end of the FAA, it's going to be a wild ride. I would tell people to put on their seatbelt because we're seeing a huge amount of infrastructure change from the from the towers down to the data centers and everywhere in between. Even how they train is going to be different, and so there's a lot of opportunity here. There's also a lot of I would say risk as someone who is always sort of scared of large scale technology changes because that always creates problems. So I think that's what we're seeing. That's what we learned in our time on Project Vector. And once again, not speaking on behalf of the advisory group and what we've seen since then. But what this means for sort of, I think, the UAV community, especially those that are thinking about jumping between the government to commercial divide too, is you really have to think about sort of two things that I think FAA and DoD and things that really the Typhoon threat actors are focused on, which is first of all software vulnerabilities. And I talked about that earlier because it's the easiest thing. If you think about how much software is developed without security in mind, we don't have in government. We have software bill of materials, SBOMs. Commercially, there really is nothing like that. But companies are beginning to put language like that in commercial contracts. And then the second is supply chain. And we've seen this, we saw this famously at Sun Micro, and there were implants within computer systems and managing your supply chain is something increasingly that we are seeing more requirements in the commercial market. And those are things that I think companies, the good news is we can learn from how the government manages some of its technology supply chain, but that's still a challenge that's sort of in the, I guess, not over the horizon, but over the next few days.
No, that's really helpful, Evan, and thank you for that. Now, I want to make sure the lawyers here get their CLE credit. So I'm going to ask Dan and Evan one more question before we go to questions from the audience. And that's when you're talking to clients who are in the commercial drone context, what's, one thing that keeps coming up and one thing that you keep seeing concerns about? Maybe it's something that's applicable in other domains too, but from the commercial drone context, what's a concern that you're seeing from your clients, either legal, regulatory, or practical? What can we let our audience think about?
So I think from my perspective, hands down, the number one is competition from China. If you have DJI with 76% of the global market, and you are a U.S. domestic manufacturer of drones, it is very difficult to compete with heavily subsidized drones that are coming in, particularly when we've got still segments within the federal, state, local apparatus that are buying some of these drones.
Yep.
So that has been and continues to be a major challenge. And I think one of the vanguards of this, I think, is the Department of Defense. And they have, with Congress, worked hard to bolster as much as possible the domestic manufacturer of UAS, or at least non-Chinese manufacturer of UAS systems. And I think we're going to see that there's a reconciliation bill right now making its way through Congress. There is a defense component to that with $150 billion in funding, generational investments for the Department of Defense. And one of those is in the domestic industrial base and specifically within UAS.
Yeah.
So that's helpful.
Really helpful. Thanks, Dan. Yeah. Evan?
I think there are probably three things that we see pop up all the time. When I was at MITRE, we always talked about how we get technology in the battlefield. This was a while ago when we were still really struggling with that concept. Here, it's how do we get regulations into the operational environment of commercial drones, the sort of reg tops. I should trademark that after this. But really, the concept is that, how do you take, for example, privacy regulations in California? There's a lot of very specific requirements for what data you're allowed to collect and not allowed to collect. How do you turn that into an operational platform? It's really hard. You have to understand the technology and you have to understand the legal and regulatory environment. And that's just not only the security issues, but some of the privacy issues. And sometimes it's actually just the commercial and corporate issues in terms of how you're structured as well. So that's the first issue that we see coming up all the time. The second that is really changing too is liability and how we think about liability protection, how companies are structured, how they, because you're not software companies, it can't sort of hide behind the fact that you can just release one product and then wait for it to start failing, as Microsoft, as large software companies do, and then update it over time. You really have to make sure that you don't have those sort of critical flaws in it. And so how you manage that liability system is another issue. And the last is incidents. Because I'm a lawyer who spent my whole career only doing one thing, cyber. So I think about life in terms of the 1,000+ data breaches and cybersecurity incidents I've worked on. And when we have a manufacturer of drones or organizations that are working this space, incident response is a little different if you have operational things that are used commercially, by everyone from adults to children in all sorts of authorized and unauthorized environments. And so how you think about, we talked about earlier, doing patches and software updates, that's different. But also how you do notifications is a little different, the speed of which you do it. And so having, and I hate to sort of put a plug for lawyers in here, but having lawyers that, but having lawyers that understand sort of how to do incident response, that understand your company, and so you're not sort of exchanging the sort of the business cards in the battlefield during it, when there is an incident or a breach or an accident, and you can actually start sort of going very quickly. Because I'll say that's the one thing that's changed in my space over the 20 years is the speed of incident response. That is just sort of, we used to have days before there were, class actions filed. Now sometimes it's a day or two. We used to have weeks before we had to do notifications. Now it's a couple days. So really being prepared for that incident, having a good plan, having sort of people and a team in place, making sure most importantly, your CEO and your general counsel understand what their role is when there is an incident. Those are all things that companies should be really focused on right now.
Thank you. And Bryan, you had another thought on this?
Just to put a little plug in for the Ukrainian talent that's about to enter the market. As soon as the war is done, we're going to see this proliferation of folks who not only, I mean, they've had a long tradition of doing like subcontracting work or contracting work on cyber stuff or programming, like all of this stuff. All those people have retooled to war production. And when I say war production, we're talking about like thousands of drones a day or tens of thousands of drones a day. They've gone through iteration cycles on wartime productions in the thousands per day. So they've lived it and done it and worked through things that in the U.S. we're still kind of theorizing about. And it's in practice now, but they're busy. And it's part of what Orqa has a challenge with too, is we're largely like the priority is the war for us. Entering the U.S. market is kind of like, that'd be nice. We'd love to work with the U.S. on this stuff, and we have a U.S. entity, and we're now like we're tooling that up. But the war is still happening. As soon as it's done, though, I hope that our industry is ready to capitalize on it, to work with those folks and really learn from them. Bring them in a role that's able to maximize the experience that they've had, because it's incalculable what that's worth.
Thank you for that, Bryan. That's great. And Leo, you wanted to build on that?
Yeah, just one comment, which is I have conversations with people in the public safety space, and they're scared to death of that because they're going to go for the best hire, and that might be in the black market where all of a sudden now you've got non-state actors with increased capabilities around drones, and it's not just going to be the airborne ones; it's ground, especially water-based and subsea, and so the whole space is just becoming much stranger from a security perspective. Yeah. And unless we jump in with both feet with the experience that we can find globally, we will be behind.
Yeah, and if you think that's just theory, look up the Tri-Borders area after the Troubles in Ireland. The massive amount of suicide bomb vests, like the what do you call it, circuitry and all that, it's produced in the Tri-Borders area in South America, because all the bomb makers, all the talent from the bomb makers from Ireland fled to South America. They ended up in a spot that's really easy to smuggle through. And for years and years, they still produce 70% of the material support for Hezbollah comes from South America in this little Tri-Borders area. So it's a huge issue, and we have the potential of having that happen again. So capturing the talent is not just, this is great, but it's also a security issue for us.
Yeah, make jobs and also protect us. So that's great. We have a couple minutes for questions. I want to make sure people also speak with our panelists afterwards. Talk to them. They're humans. Get their information. That's really important. Yeah, the lawyers aren't human. Sorry about that. But I want to make sure you guys have time for closing remarks. But any questions before we get to that?
Thanks, Don. Hi, Bri O'Neill. Leo and Evan both mentioned the long durations between software releases. I'm familiar with why that happens. Can you talk at all about what opportunity it would present if we were to disappear that problem? Long durations between software releases. We were talking about radars specifically a second ago, but I'm sure from a security perspective, you have some thoughts.
Well, the challenge is not just radar, right? I mean, the response to a rapidly increasing threat is typically not hardware, it's software. And so how we allow for software to mature is sort of critical. And it's not just a component, right? It's got to be the entire C2, because when you change a component, you can break a bunch of things within there. And so you've got to time these things relative to the ability of the individuals to be able to work with it, right? And so simplicity matter. And in some sense, we have to take the capabilities that made software distribution simple for consumers and figure out how to do that in the DoD space. But we also have to get rid of there's a great number of impediments contractually as to when things can be touched. And that really is part of what needs to be changed to allow the program, both the users, the buyers, and the suppliers, to determine what that might be the right pace of software upgrades within that environment. But right now, it's just blocked everywhere, which is the problem.
Build on one theme, which is, it's not just upgrading radar, it's not upgrading a single component, and this is what we've learned in the sort of the C4SI space and in the battlefield space, is that you really have to hold the whole concept of how we use technology in all areas. And that's what, once again, this is what the good news is that the FAA is in the process of developing that sort of next gen. We've been doing next gen. FAA has been doing next gen for 20 years, but it's gotten real very quickly, very recently. So, do we need to have sort of integrated sort of components of it, whether it's radar or C2 or others? Absolutely. But what we really need to have is a updated integrated model, and that's what's being developed. Because the problem, like everything, whenever I'm talking to people overseas, the problem with the U.S. is just the scale and the size and the amount of infrastructure that we have and the amount of consumers we have and amount of flights we have. It's just so much larger than anywhere else in the world. So, but I think we're getting there.
This is for Bryan. Bryan, really appreciate everything you're doing over in Ukraine. I'm retired Air Force. I have a question, and it's more, we could talk offline later, but I think it's something that might be insightful for everybody. When it came to the military operations and using drones in the battle space, how are the operators, the command control, and folks dealing with the weather challenges in Ukraine? I mean, I know you get wind, you get cold, you get pretty shitty weather from time to time, and I'm just curious, how are they dealing with that, and how are the drones? What's the attrition rate, I would say, based on weather, if you have any experience with that?
The biggest issue with weather is the cold, not so much the wind or anything. Like, you can fight through that. The other thing is visual odometry is completely useless in war. I mean, the issue with it isn't that it's completely doesn't work. It's that it doesn't work when you need it. So when it comes to the approach, a lot of folks are using visual odometry in a way that is the cheapest approach because it's what makes the most, the most profit margin or whatever. If I had one piece of advice for the visual odometry folks or folks who are doing visual navigation is, it's, that whole like buy once, cry once kind of thing. Rather than upgrading your sensors later, we have good sensors now. Use good sensors to begin with, because there is stuff that can help, like with seeing through the snow and all those kinds of things. Because being able to see through the snow and see some of the landmark features through that can actually help with navigation. Even some of the stuff that can get some depth and things like that. So that's a big deal. When you start getting into some of the larger drones, obviously we have the typical like icing issues on surface areas. The other thing is voltage drops on batteries is probably one of the huge things. There is a lot of work. I think that SOCOM had a recent test experimentation in Norway where they did some Arctic testing. So there's some really cool battery technology out there that's great and overcoming a lot of those issues. So the other big issues is a lot of times is design concepts, and especially when you start to get design concepts with integrations. This is where I actually speak really highly of some of the third-party integrators who are doing stuff with, whether it's munitions or like really complex payloads that are heavy, and stuff that shifts the center of gravity of your drone down. Because if you had that center of gravity quite low, as you're fighting the wind, you have to offset that payload. And a lot of these drones, they may be designed with certain specs and certain wind resistance based on, the typical payload. But then when you put a bigger payload and a bigger payload, and then, let's see if it'll carry this one. Yeah, technically it can carry that one. But when you get over like 5 mile an hour wind, it can no longer offset the weight of that lower thing in order to move itself with these multicopters. So all those challenges, everything, I wish there was like a little like sliding scale where you could, say, okay, how cold is it? Here's my typical flight time. Here's my milliamp hours in my battery. Like, let's do that then. You just put on like a mortgage calculator, it's like, how much equity do I have? Those sorts of things, like the ability to calculate those things is really good. But, it's going to be a challenge just like with the software updates. You have new chemistry, you have new packet designs on different cells. So it's an ongoing process that there's definitely folks working on. It's a matter of, proofing that out in reality.
Thank you, Bryan. And I think that's a great example of battlefield experiences that can be applied really effectively in commercial context. So we're going to wrap up now. If everyone could give 30 seconds, final remark, a final thought, and then how we can contact you moving forward. Maybe start with Leo. Yeah.
The last shall be first. So Leo McCloskey, Echodyne. I wish it were an easy problem, but it's an incredibly complex one, and it's very technology centric. And so all of the good intentions of people who don't understand technology don't help, actually. And so part of where we are as an industry, I think the industry is ready to engage. I think what we need to see is the framework upon which industry can engage. And once we have that framework in place, I think we'll have the opportunity to secure what we need to secure. But until then, it really is going to be a struggle.
One thing that I like to say is if you want to know what the priorities are of an organization, look to where they spend their money. And if you look in the defense reconciliation package that's currently going through Congress, there's $1.3 billion just for counter UAS research and development. So that says a lot, I think, about the importance that the Department of Defense and Congress writ large sees regarding this technology. There's a lot of opportunities available in that space to help. Now we just need the sort of the legislative infrastructure in place to regulate that.
I kind of going back on top of that, I don't like giving problems that we're having in Congress without offering some solutions. So the solutions are right here in this in this hallway here. They're here at the show, whether it's joining AUVSI's advocacy committees or writing your personal congressman or congresswoman and saying, hey, enough's enough. We need to be able to move integration forward. We need to be able to move counter UAS forward. I mean, the White House right now has made this a priority. Congress is still dealing with reconciliation and budget issues, but it's going to turn the corner in a month or so, and they're going to start figuring out, we got to get something, we got to cobble it together. Now's the time to kind of build that voice, build that grassroots effort, and get them moving.
I don't know if anybody was following the Munich Security Conference. I was across the street from the little terrorist attack that happened over there, and went into the DIU thing. And then a bunch of stuff happened that week with Munich Security Conference, and I feel like a lot of bridges were burned. There was a lot of motivation done on the European side to, it's pushing a lot of the rearmament, a lot of that's sort of spending. I manage the partner programs for Orqa, and I really believe in partnerships. And right now, you have a whole bunch of people in Europe who are spooling up and have been spooling up for that innovation. So work with your partners, build bridges overseas. The folks in Europe are ready to work with the U.S.
And last, I would say, know your AI, not the steak sauce, but know how AI is used both in your products, how it's being used in unauthorized and unauthorized ways, how it's being used by people to re-engineer your products. There's just a huge knowledge gap between permissible and non-permissible use of AI and how it's used in the product life cycle, and that's something that you really have to get in front of.
Thank you all so much. Can we get a round of applause?